So for those who are keeping score at home, the theme of our lecture series this semester has been revolutions of various kinds. And we've had events that have explored various facets of revolutions, some in the past, like the Bolshevik Revolution that took place 100 years ago yesterday. Also some more recent revolutionary changes in places like the Arab world with the Arab Spring or Venezuela. But it's been interesting that up to this point, we haven't really directly grappled with some of the revolutions that many of us first think about when we think about the word revolution. And these are the political revolutions that transformed the world in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The revolutions that sometimes means that we give this period the title, the Age of Revolutions. And so I'm delighted that we have three experts here to share their thoughts on the American, French, and Haitian revolutions because of their importance in both in terms of the topic of revolution, but of world history more generally. And so we'll hear first from Matt Mason, a member of the BYU history faculty who earned his PhD from the University of Maryland, who's an expert in early American history, but increasingly interested in Atlantic history, ways that the United States and Europe are linked. Then we'll hear from Karen Carter, who earned her PhD from Georgetown University, expert on the history of France. And then finally from Chris Hodson, who earned his PhD from Northwestern University and is an expert in colonial and transatlantic history. And so we will go to that point.
Thank you, Kirk, and thank you all for being here today. It's an honor to be on this panel with Karen and Chris, and I hope that this will be an illuminating discussion. I just want to say a few kind of general things about the American Revolution, as much as will fit into the time allotted, and draw a bit on my own research ongoing on the era of the American Revolution. For many decades, especially in the mid-20th century, the American Revolution was celebrated as far more conservative than some of those crazy revolutions like the French Revolution with their guillotines or the Russian Revolution, the Soviet Revolution earlier in the century, as an essentially moderate affair led by gentlemen reclaiming their British rights, sort of a thing. In more recent historiography, the American Revolution has been taking a beating precisely for that thing, for being entirely too limited in its implications for people of color, for women, for people who are not elite white males. It is taking multiple beatings along those lines. But I want to make the case today that while in many ways the hashtag would be "it's complicated," that the American Revolution had more of a revolutionary impact than that would suggest, and for two major reasons. One is in the shorter term and medium term, the impact of the American Revolutionary War, and then secondly, the impact of the ideas of the American Revolution. The war itself, if you don't count Vietnam forward, is our longest war, 8 years of war with the British and between Americans. It's a bloody civil war as well as a war between redcoats and American soldiers, and it proved extraordinarily disruptive of American society. An estimated 80,000 loyalists, people loyal to the British Crown, were driven from the country, displaced from the country. Most of them had their property confiscated. Per capita, that is 6 times more per capita than fled the French Revolution, than fled France during that revolution. There were 20,000 or so black loyalists, slaves, American slaves who gained their freedom from the British Army and left the United States to gain that freedom in 1783. They went to various places in the Atlantic world. It's a fascinating story. So that's a displacement that had an unusual impact in northern colonies, where about 8,000 slaves fled the American Revolution. In terms of Native Americans, the outcome of the American Revolutionary War changed the power dynamics. In the 18th century, Native Americans had developed a pattern of playing one power off the other, the French and the English. During the American Revolutionary War, they tried doing that with the British and the Americans, and then most of them sided with the losing side in that war, and were left to deal with the United States of America, and that was a very different and much more negative power relationship. So in terms of displaced peoples and power relationships across the continent, the war itself and its outcome had an enormous impact. And then the ideas of the American Revolution had an ongoing, both immediate and ongoing impact deep into the 19th century and beyond. the impact of the ideas of the American Revolution is famously uneven, especially for people who were not white and male. But it did have ongoing impacts that I want to discuss today. Despite the limitations on who could vote and who could participate in American politics, it did expand enormously in the early 19th century as people drew on the ideas of the American Revolution to redefine voting as a right that they could access, and voting, despite the fact that most founding fathers, as in all founding fathers that I know of, agreed that only people who held a certain amount of property should vote. People lower in the social scale took those ideas of rights and ran with them and expanded suffrage, the right of suffrage, in the early 19th century in dramatic ways, to where the United States developed this political culture that was so broadly participatory for white males that people referred to this as universal suffrage. In state after state after state, they displaced property qualifications with universal suffrage. Now, by that they meant all white males that could pay taxes, or sometimes just straight up all white adult males could vote. That sounds restrictive to us because of the terms white and male. In the 19th century, that made this the most broadly participatory democratic culture that I know of. The case that I know best by way of comparison is Britain, and they had a torturous politics of reform for expanding the right to vote and the right to participate in politics that led to this very incremental reform in 1832 and then 1867, and it wasn't really till the 20th century that the British could point to the same levels of participation in politics as the Americans did. Those left out of that formula of universal white male suffrage, the ideas of the American Revolution gave them the similar kind of leverage. And so when women's rights advocates met, they would constantly do things like meet on July 4th and do things like, the famous example of this is the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. Women arguing for the right to vote as well as many other political rights modeled their proclamation on the Declaration of Independence. And instead of leveraging a bunch of grievances against George III, they just leveraged a bunch of grievances against men. So men took the place of George III, and a lot of the same kind of rhetoric, touchstones of the American Revolution, proved to be extraordinarily useful in the long term for people like women advocating for better political participation. Same is true for abolitionists. This is my own research, focuses on the impact of things like the ideas of the American Revolution on slavery and people's efforts to advance the rights of African Americans once they became free. And abolitionists constantly, why would they not, constantly leverage the ideas of the American Revolution. One historian, his name is Bernard Bailyn, writing decades ago, called this kind of effect the contagion of liberty. That as people use the ideas of the American Revolution to appeal for rights that the Founding Fathers had not contemplated when they wrote things like all men are created equal, that had an ongoing impact as people were able to successfully use those ideas. And that began very early. Right now I'm researching the politics leading up to the American Revolution and the ways in which slavery played a role in that. And just very briefly, American patriots running around saying that the Stamp Act and various other acts of Parliament were going to enslave them. To which many British loyalists said, what in tarnation do you mean that the Stamp Act is going to enslave you? You know you have real slaves, right? So what precisely do you mean that this means slavery? And that forced many patriots in the years leading up to the American Revolution to clarify what they meant. What we mean is slavery means the lack of consent and being taxed and otherwise have your property taken away from you without that consent. So they had to get really specific and targeted in terms of what they meant by the S word leading up to the American Revolution. For some patriots, that meant they then took the next step and said, you know what that means is that slavery of all sorts is wrong. If we are in a situation where we are the masters and we have slaves, that means that's wrong. There were many patriots who were creative enough to avoid that conclusion. So there's a range of implications for actual slaves of this rhetoric of slavery. But one of those outcomes was a much emboldened and empowered abolitionist movement in the United States, consisting of African American, slave and free, as well as white Americans, leveraging the ideas of the American Revolution. And then I will just finally mention briefly that in recent British literature, British historiography, the American Revolution is elevating in importance. For decades, probably more than decades, British historians tended to kind of gloss over the American Revolution as an especially important event in Britain itself. That is changing, especially as people pay attention to this kind of crisis in confidence in the British Empire as they lose half of their colonies as a result of the American Revolution. And that crisis of confidence was something that abolitionists in particular could, again, I keep using this word, leverage to say, well, what kind of empire do we want to be going forward? Do we want to be a just and holy empire, or do we want to be continually exploiting people? God's judgment came upon us in the American Revolution, and we lost half our empire. If we want to keep doing that, great. But if we want to reform our empire and go forward stronger and more holy, we should abolish, starting with the slave trade and then slavery. And that ended up, along with many other arguments, to be a powerful argument in the kind of tool belt of the British abolitionists. And so British historians are starting to pay more attention to this crisis in the empire. So I hope in these brief opening statements I've at least thrown out some provocative thoughts that maybe we can have discussion about. Thank you.
Okay, my research, my own research, deals with rural life, and especially social and religious interactions that took place among peasants in the 18th century. So I thought I would talk some today about what the French Revolution meant for peasants, both in the long and short terms. And I'll start with the early days of the Revolution. In preparation for the meeting of the Estates General in 1789, communities all over France drew up what are known as cahiers de doléances, or lists of grievances. A few years ago, I came across one of these lists copied into the journal of a schoolmaster named Delahaye, who lived in the village of Silly, today about 20 minutes north of Charles de Gaulle Airport. He reported that on March 1st, 1789, the villagers of Silly met to draw up their cahiers. And here are the major points. First, the villagers complained that the local nobles let the wild game do damage to their fields. According to the law at that time, the villagers were not allowed to hunt this game themselves, and in fact were expected to take measures to preserve the animals so that the nobles could hunt them. Second, the villagers complained that 20 years earlier, a woman was weeding in the fields and took a partridge egg. This so-called theft was witnessed by one of the nobles' gamekeepers, and the woman was taken to prison for 10 days. Third, the villagers complained that a gamekeeper had killed a beggar for stealing and eating fruit from the nobles' trees. Nothing was done to punish the gamekeeper. The cahier states it was as if he had the right to kill him. Fourth, the villagers urged that the seigneurial justice system be reformed and called for the abolition of feudal privileges. This is the essence of the cahier from Silly, the abolition of feudal privilege. Delahaye and his fellow villagers believed that everyone should be equal before the law and that no one should have special privileges because of their birth. They always saw any problems with the lack of grain or a problem with food supply in these terms. They blamed the nobility for taking more than their share. And in fact, the cahier states that the game animals were eating more grain than it would take to feed the entire village. Cahiers from villages all over France contained similar statements about noble abuses, and one of the first things that the revolutionaries in Paris did was to abolish feudal privilege. In August, the people of Silly received word that the nobles had lost their rights over hunting, so everyone in the village headed out to the forest, bringing back deer and other small game. This was their first major victory in the revolution, and it was one that would, in the long run at least, last. Over the course of the 19th century, the nobility all over Europe disappeared. No more feudal rights, no more feudal courts, and they lost their tax-exempt status. Government and military careers became open to talent rather than birth or inheritance. And up until this point in the history of France, peasants had no political voice. When the Estates General had met in the Middle Ages, representatives came from 3 estates: nobles, clergy, and townspeople. The Third Estate at that time did not include peasants, who were lumped in with the nobility. By the time of 1789, the Third Estate still primarily meant urban dwellers, so rural people like Delahaye and the farmers whose children he taught had compiled their cahiers but had almost no other political role. The Revolution changed that too, at least started to change it. On January 31st, 1790, the inhabitants of Silly met together once again. Their purpose was to create a new municipal government for their village, now a commune of 550 people. The new mayor and municipal officers were chosen by vote, but as you might have guessed, not everyone had the right to vote. Only those who had paid at least 3 livres in taxes, thus only 29 men in the village of Silly, voted. But a new principle of political legitimacy had now been enshrined by the events of the Revolution: national sovereignty and citizenship. Nations, not kings, elites, or churches, were the supreme source of authority in human affairs. Appeals to national sovereignty would be found all over the world in the next 2 centuries. Now, of course, it took a while for France to truly implement ideas of national sovereignty and voting rights. After the Revolution, only a few 100,000 men voted in elections for national representative bodies. People like Delahaye wouldn't have the right to vote until after 1848, when France instituted universal male suffrage. So Matt and I will have to argue about who is truly responsible for this. Women in France didn't get the right to vote until 1945. But the principle established during the Revolution that the nation was the supreme source of authority in human affairs and that all people belonged to a nation had a profound effect on the world. Slowly and unevenly, all people truly came to mean all people, regardless of birth, economic status, gender, religion, or color of skin. Although not all nations in the world recognize this principle, it is certainly something that we should be working toward as a global community. Similarly, concepts of freedom of thought, belief, and expression, freedom from arbitrary imprisonment, and equality before the law found their expression during the French Revolution. Again, these freedoms haven't applied to everyone everywhere, but the principle of civil rights and freedoms became a part of political culture for most of the world, even for peasants like Delahaye, as a result of the Revolution. Not all of the changes of the revolutionary period were positive for rural peasants, however. Although his journal only continues until 1792, Delahaye clearly did not appreciate the chaos caused by the events of the Revolution, even before it had reached the radical stage, actually before it had started at all. In June of 1789, he notes that troops were continually passing through the region on their way to Paris, and that all anyone talked about was revolts and massacres. And this was a month before Bastille Day. At the end of July, there were rumors going around that enemies were coming to the area to steal grain. So everyone in Silly stored as much of their grain as they could in the parish church, along with their wives and daughters, while the men stood guard on the village borders. No marauders materialized, and the rumors turned out to be false, but the village started up a regular guard just in case. These sorts of events would continue on and off in rural France for the greater part of a decade, completely upsetting the rhythms of rural life. But perhaps most threatening to rural people was the attack on religion. The cahiers demonstrate that most French people before the Revolution believed that Catholicism should remain the religion of the state, but that its wealth should be distributed more evenly. Just like they believed that the nobles were the cause of their lack of food, people believed that the wealthy and elite bishops and abbots were taking too much of the tithe money. They wanted a greater percentage of that money to go to their local priests and for the upkeep of the churches and parish buildings. Virtually no one indicated that France should get rid of priests or the church altogether. Unfortunately, that is exactly what the revolutionaries in Paris tried to do. As a result of the civil constitution of the clergy in 1790, priests and bishops became servants of the state. All clergy had to take a loyalty oath to the state, and those who refused lost their positions. Those who did take the oath faced more and more political pressure to conform to the ever-changing revolutionary ideas about religion. The revolutionary government known as the Convention outlawed the celebration of the Mass and began pressuring the clergy to tear up their letters of ordination and to get married. The revolutionary armies forced the local governments to establish the cult of reason and to celebrate national festivals instead of Christian ones. This was obviously a very bad time for the clergy. 2,000 to 3,000 were killed during the revolution and about 30,000 were exiled. But even beyond this, dechristianization was a disaster in most of the countryside. Although there had been some people who spoke out against the revolutionary changes before 1792, when the dechristianization movement really took off, this was the line in the sand for many people who now gave up supporting the revolution altogether. Villages became divided between supporters of the revolution and counter-revolutionaries, with religion as the major focus of dispute between them. Counter-revolutionaries broke into the churches and found whatever priest they could, whether he had taken the loyalty oath or not, to say the Mass. And if there was no priest, they held their own services, often with men like schoolmasters officiating. There were some rather dramatic episodes of resistance to the dechristianization efforts as well. In one village, the mayor, who sided with the revolution, tried to arrest some religious teachers for not taking an oath to the new government, but the women of the town rioted in support of the teachers. So the mayor arrested about 100 of these women and put them in jail. Then their husbands rioted to get them back. The mayor released the women, who then reorganized, returned to the jail, released the teachers, and beat up the mayor. In another village, a local official was leading a festival celebrating the Supreme Being when, quote, at a sign from an old woman, the entire female audience rose, turned their backs on the altar of liberty, and raised their skirts to expose their bare buttocks and to express their feelings to the new deity. Confronted by the spectacle of rows of naked female backsides, the celebrant was reduced to gibberish. So revolutionaries' treatment of religion thus left a complicated legacy for rural people. Dechristianization turned people away from the revolution, even some people who might have otherwise supported liberalizing tendencies. For the next century, politics was divided between liberals, who supported national sovereignty and civil freedoms, but were anti-religion, and conservatives, who supported monarchy and an alliance between church and state. Peasants ended up coming out of the revolution on the more conservative side. Not until the end of the 19th century was the peasant vote split among multiple political parties. For decades, political leanings in just about any French region could be predicted by whether a majority of the parish priests had taken the loyalty oath in 1790. The experience of rural people during the revolution can thus tell us something about revolutions themselves. They are complex, messy, and they head in unintended directions. They are never fully satisfying to any one group, let alone a society or nation, always too radical for some, too conservative for others. The dangers, at least in the short term, always seem to outweigh the benefits, and people living through them always seem to wish that they weren't. In the long term, they might provide benefits, even if those benefits are incomplete and mixed with setbacks and losses. And yet, throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, human societies across the globe kept having them. Revolution had become a way of getting things done. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the revolutionary period that the three of us are talking about today is simply this: more revolutions. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone for coming. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak about the Haitian Revolution with my colleagues Matt and Karen. Now, I will say that one thing I don't want to do is turn this into a kind of fight among the three of us about whose revolution was most revolutionary.
Since you know you'll lose.
But if I did want to do that, I might take a couple of interpretive cheap shots here at the beginning of my remarks. So I obviously am here to talk about the Haitian Revolution. They are here to talk about the American and French Revolutions. Let me just remind you that the French Revolution terminates first in a dictatorship, then in an empire, then in the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy. And monarchy, in fact, endures in France as a concept till well into, deep into the 19th century. I'll remind you, too, that the revolution in places like, let's say, Virginia, had, on some level, moderate effects. So if you think about who's in charge in a place like Virginia in 1760, well, it's rich white guys who own slaves. Who's in charge in Virginia in 1820? Well, it's still rich white guys who own slaves. On the other hand, the Haitian Revolution encompasses the largest and most successful slave revolt in the history of the world, and that slave revolt is the greatest possible challenge to the existing 18th century order of imperial capitalism and racial slavery. and the establishment not only of the second independent republic in the New World, the Republic of Haiti, but the first state of really any kind to be run by men who had once been the property of other men in the system of Atlantic slavery. So if we're thinking about kind of radical transformations, I think it's useful to think in terms of what's going on in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which is going to become, of course, the independent nation of Haiti. Now, I wager, too, that most of us as undergraduate students, I certainly was like this, don't know all that much about the Haitian Revolution. So I thought it might be useful to give a kind of quick sort of 2-minute drill version of what that revolution is and help us think through a little bit of some of its effects on politics and society and economics moving forward. So first off, what is Haiti and where is it? Well, in the 18th century, the independent nation of Haiti, what is now the independent nation of Haiti, was the French colony of Saint-Domingue. And Saint-Domingue is kind of a Frenchy way of saying Santo Domingo. Haiti right now, if you look for Florida, then go down to Cuba, then hang a right, Haiti is sort of the western third of the island of Hispaniola. And it is, in the 18th century, the most profitable and most horrifying colony on Earth. It is the mainspring of the French economy. About 40% of the world's sugar is produced in Saint-Domingue, along with massive amounts of coffee, indigo, and cotton. The colony is, of course, so profitable because it relies on African labor on a nearly unprecedented scale and with nearly unprecedented brutality. By 1789, which is the year that the French Revolution begins, there are some 500,000 African slaves in Saint-Domingue, so that's 500,000 enslaved people. Their life expectancy after setting foot in Saint-Domingue is about 7 years, which means that at any given time, about 1/3 of those 500,000 slaves had been born in Africa. It's very tempting interpretively to think of the Haitian Revolution, in fact, as an African revolution merely taking place in the New World. Compared that to Saint-Domingue's population of about 30,000 free white people and about 30,000 free people of mixed race ancestry. Those slaves, of course, are subject to an unbelievable regime of psychological abuse, physical torture, including mutilation and death, and for women, sexual abuse and rape. The historian David Gegas, a kind of pioneering historian of Saint-Domingue, estimates that in the 1780s, at any given time, between 20 and 25% of enslaved women under 20 years old either are pregnant with a white man's child or have recently had a white man's child. The French Revolution that begins in 1789, of course, echoes in Saint-Domingue. It triggers a conflict, a really complicated conflict over race and autonomy. So big sugar planter types, and you can imagine why this is so, they want to use the French Revolution and its ideas to gain more colonial autonomy. And what that means is they kind of want to be able to trade with whoever they can trade with. And they also, of course, want to maintain a very strict racial slave regime. Those free people of mixed race ancestry, on the other hand, they want to use the revolution to gain political rights that had been denied to them on the basis of their racial ancestry. On the other hand, poor pro-revolutionary whites want to break the wealthy planters' stranglehold over political power in Saint-Domingue and retain their sense of racial superiority, i.e. they don't want mixed-race folks to have political rights, and for sure they don't want slaves to have political rights. Now, beginning in 1789, this kind of conflict really roils the colony. It creates a kind of power vacuum. Sometimes in my classes, I force my students to think about Hodson's first law of revolution, which is that there must be a split in the elite. And this is what occurs in Saint-Domingue. The elite really shatters over the issue of the French Revolution. And into that void step the slaves themselves. In August of 1791, there is a massive and coordinated slave revolt that begins on the plantations in the hills above what's now Cap-Haïtien, which is the major city on the northern coast of Haiti, and that very quickly spreads throughout the rest of the colony. The next couple of years in Saint-Domingue, so after 1791, are spent kind of mired in what is for us a very, very confusing civil war. There are ex-slave armies that kind of remarkably are funded by the opportunistic Spanish king, who thinks of them as maybe a proxy by which they can kind of conquer Saint-Domingue, valuable colony that it is. Men like Toussaint Louverture, who's going to become the sort of primary African leader of the Haitian Revolution, are fighting, ironically, for Catholicism and kingship and against the French Revolution during this period. Also, many of those ex-slave armies get their funding by, in fact, trafficking in slaves. So if you're confused, so were the French people who were observing this happen. Things changed pretty radically, though, in 1793, kind of by accident. Two agents of the French Revolutionary government are kind of competing for power in the city of Cap Français, which is the kind of major city of Saint-Domingue. One of them is a civil commissioner who'd been sent by the revolutionary government in Paris, and the other is just the governor of Saint-Domingue. And they wind up coming into armed conflict in this city, Cap Français, over who actually rules the colony. And the civil commissioner, who's a guy kind of, alas, sort of lost to history, but incredibly important, his name is Léger Félicité Sonthonax. Sonthonax is his last name. He does something really remarkable in that in the midst of this armed conflict, this kind of white-on-white civil war in Cap Français, he makes a really wild decision. He issues a proclamation to the slaves in the city of Cap Français that says, hey, if you fight on my side, I'll give you your liberty. The slaves take him up, of course, on that offer. And pretty soon, that Emancipation Proclamation that he's produced starts to spread throughout the entire colony. And so by sort of fiat, this kind of civil commissioner of the French Revolution issues the world's first emancipation decree, and he liberates those 500,000 slaves. Now, of course, they've already taken their own liberty. He's just sort of stamping the French Revolution's seal of approval on that emancipation. Sonthonax then, of course, has to go back to France to explain what happened, which must have been quite the conversation with the French Revolutionary government. You know, see what happened was, I wound up kind of liberating 500,000 slaves. I hope that's okay. And so at that point, the French Revolutionary government is really faced with a choice. They can either continue to fight these rebelling slaves and attempt to, potentially re-enslave them, or they can liberate them. They can accept Sonthonax's emancipation decree and turn those 500,000 slaves into 500,000 fire-breathing French patriots who might be able to help them fight the wars that they are then fighting against the British and Spanish empires. And that's, in fact, what the French Revolutionary government does in 1794, and they wind up abolishing slavery throughout the whole of the French Empire. Now, in the wake of all of this happening, by the time we get to 1801 and 1802, the leadership of Saint-Domingue, mostly Toussaint Louverture, has become really quite independent in many respects of the French government. Napoleon Bonaparte, who is then in charge in France, desperately wants to bring Saint-Domingue to heel because it is such a valuable colony. He therefore, in 1801 and 1802, attempts to re-invade Saint-Domingue and potentially re-enslave the people who were freed in 1794. That invasion fails kind of colossally as a result of disease and military resistance, of course, by the liberated slaves. And that leads in early 1804 to the declaration of Haitian independence. That is the separation of an independent republic from the French Empire. Now, as a result of this process, Haiti, of course, is going to become a kind of pariah state. France tries to force it, and in fact is successful ultimately in forcing it, to pay indemnities to the planters who lost land and capital during the Haitian Revolution. The United States of America, first under President Jefferson and later under other Southern presidents, embargoes Haiti in an attempt to impoverish it and in fact to contain Matt's contagion of liberty so it doesn't spread into the United States and provoke slave revolts there. However, the Haitian Revolution also acts as a kind of powerful inspiration on many, many different levels. There's a funny quote that I like. It's from, of all people, a Polish poet who is kind of keeping tabs on the Haitian Revolution really actively in 1803. And he writes from Warsaw at this point, "If the spirit of Toussaint Louverture enlivens the blacks, then we can expect a remarkable phenomenon in the political firmament." And that's, in fact, what occurs. All major American slave revolts, from Gabriel Prosser's in 1800 all the way through Nat Turner's in 1833, reference Saint-Domingue and Haiti and Toussaint Louverture as an inspiration. African-American culture really claims Toussaint Louverture and the Saint-Domingue Revolution as a kind of touchstone. This is a quote from the diary of a free black person from the state of New York in the 1850s. He says, "The result of the insurrection in Saint Domingo has long been known among the slaves of the South. The name of Toussaint Louverture has been passed from mouth to mouth until it's become a secret household word. And a love of liberty fed by a love of arms has been rendered universal and almost omnipotent. It has been felt that it was right for the colored Haitians to fight to be free, and it is equally right for the colored Americans." So there's no question that the Haitian Revolution generates this incredible amount of sympathy and fellow feeling, not just among African Americans, but among indigenous peoples and peoples of color globally. All sorts of folks, from Simon Bolivar to Kwame Nkrumah to Jomo Kenyatta, throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, who are interested in resisting imperialism and capitalism that they deem exploitative, reference Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Revolution in some pretty powerful ways. Now, there is, of course, a flip side to this, and that is that the Haitian Revolution terrifies defenders of white supremacy. And as Matt can tell you, thinking about the American Civil War, as people make their arguments in the South about whether or not to secede from the Federal Republic in 1859 and 1860 and 1861, their primary reference point, I would argue, is Haiti. They are telling other Southerners, look, there is only one answer to this problem, and it is secession. Otherwise, you will have a new Haitian Revolution. You will have blacks in power. You will have blacks having sex with your daughters. That is the argument that they're making. So if we're looking for sort of revolutions that sort of radiate outward and affect in really profound ways the way the 19th and 20th centuries develop, I think one of the places that we can start is almost certainly Haiti. Thank you.
Thanks to all three of our presenters. They've obviously given us a lot to think about, and we actually have a little time to discuss. And so we ask if you have questions that, for the benefit of our listening audience, that you come to the microphone on this side here. And if you're a BYU student, please introduce yourself. Tell us your name and tell us what you're studying.
Maybe a question for Matt Mason. You mentioned that the American revolutionaries were reclaiming their British rights, I think you termed it. That's interesting to me. And I wonder if you could comment on whether or not those founders of the United States called their action a revolution, or I read that they preferred calling it a war of independence because they resisted the idea of revolutions, or at least disliked revolutions. So would you comment on that?
Thank you. Is this working? Okay, it's a good question. Let me say first that if radicalist is best, then I agree with Chris. And I kind of drew the short straw. I would have preferred to talk about the Haitian Revolution. Second, in relation to your question, we too often fall into this idea that the founders make up one unitary group, that we're all agreed on one particular, on multiple ideas. If you read the founders, they argued about everything. And so there is a range from the most radical to rather conservative revolutionaries, if you can have a conservative revolutionary. And along the conservative side of that spectrum, there is a lot more talk about vindicating their rights as British people. That's part of why it took so long for a critical mass of Americans to support becoming Americans. I mean, you've been at war with George III's legions for over a year by the time they're willing to actually resolve on independence. So for many revolutionaries, it took a lot to push them into actually being revolutionaries. And so a lot of the early rhetoric especially is about the Stamp Act or the Townsend Duties or the Tea Act or whatever as violations of their rights to full equality within the British Empire. But then you move in this direction, especially beginning in 1776, but not just then, of declaring universal statements of rights. I mean, the Declaration of Independence does not vindicate the American Revolution based on British rights, but upon these universal truths of liberty and equality being indefeasible rights. And so there is a range, and people, even some of the more moderate ones, start beginning in 1776 to realize what they're doing is a revolution. So there's even, I'm thinking about John Adams. If John Adams is willing to call this a revolution, then a lot of people should be. So it has this revolutionary turn towards a more universal kind of application.
My name is Benjamin Crawford. I'm a political science major. In every single one of your guys' discussions, you talked about the role of natural rights and how the different revolutionaries or counter-revolutionaries discussed their rights. At what point did the idea of human rights transition to a common idea rather than just like a philosophy that the elite debated, or became an actual integral part of what people believed?
Try that really quickly. So that's a really good question. Is this on too? It seems to be on. Okay, close enough. So there's a really striking case very early on in the Haitian Revolution when the army of rebelling slaves is actually making these series of attacks, probes, on the defenses of the city of Cap Français, which was again the major city in what was then Saint-Domingue. And a number of them are killed and so forth, and ultimately they're repulsed and they flee back into the forest. And when the French soldiers go out and examine the bodies of these slaves, they find in one case a copy of Tom Paine's The Rights of Man in one of the sort of corpse's clothing. So there's no question but that ideas about rights and so forth are percolating down, whether it's through actual writings or sort of oral discussions or whatever, all the way down the social scale to the enslaved folks in Saint-Domingue. So it is absolutely the case that rights talk and rights ideas are profoundly influential, I think, up and down the kind of levels of society, all the way from Great Britain and Anglo-America to revolutionary France and Saint-Domingue too.
But you're right, though, that the elites are not talking about it in this way. So these ideas have spread to other people, but the elites during the French Revolution anyway, they're not thinking about rights for regular people. Most of them are saying things like, well, we still have to have farmers to plow the fields. They're not talking about, there's a whole debate right around the time of the revolution, of the French Revolution, when they're talking about education and who should receive education. And most of the people at that point, none of them are saying that peasants should be educated beyond the church. That's it. So it's still going to take quite a while before the elites start to recognize that, hey, human rights mean all humans.
Yeah, it is a good question, and it allows me to elaborate a little bit on what I mean by this idea of a contagion of liberty. You get these high-flying statements of universal equality and liberty in the documents, and then you get people, I would argue maybe rather than percolating down, percolating up, using those ideas as leverage. I'll just give two brief anecdotes, one better known than the other, from 1776 and 1777. 1776, Abigail Adams' famous Remember the Ladies letter. It's a classic use of the ideals of the American Revolution against her husband, John. If you read the full passage, it relies on all the ideas of the American Revolution. Don't put full power into the hands of the men, because just like any other tyrant, they will misuse it. You have to remember us, or we will foment a rebellion against you, and all that sort of thing. I promise you that is not what John Adams had in mind when he helped write the Declaration of Independence, because we know, because of his response. He could not help but laugh at her strange suggestion that that's what they had in mind by the American Revolution, right? That's one classic and best-known example. Second example, more successful for this individual, is a slave named Prince, who in 1777 belonged to a master named William Whipple.
who had traveled with him to fight the battles of the American Revolution. In fact, he was rowing American troops across the Delaware on Christmas night, for crying out loud, to fight the battles of liberty, but was still a slave. His master came home in the spring of 1776 and then was going back to fight, 1777, the battles of the Revolution, decided not to take Prince with him. Prince seemed dejected. The master asked him, "Why are you so dejected?" Surely fishing for a compliment. I'm sure he thought Prince was going to say, "I'm going to miss you." Instead, Prince says, "You are going to fight for your liberty, but I have no liberty to fight for." And William Whipple apparently had never considered that thought before, and went down to the courthouse and filled out freedom papers, manumitted Prince. So that's a much more successful appeal to the ideas of liberty, but it's percolating up as people take these high-flying ideas and put them into practice.
So I think that is, my name is Bennett Norda. I'm a math major. I think that it's really interesting how all three of these revolutions took place within the same couple decades of each other. And we already talked a bit about how the French Revolution influenced the Haitian Revolution, but I want to know a bit about, like, how did the American Revolution influence these other two revolutions?
My first answer is always very little. The French Revolution was its own thing, so we'll let these others talk about it first, and then I'll see if I have a response.
So it's a really interesting question, sort of how the American Revolution impacts the Haitian Revolution. And there's no doubt that enslaved peoples in the Caribbean and free people of color in the Caribbean are in fact active participants in the American Revolution. So just to give one example, the French, of course, are allied with the American patriots during the Revolution. They recruit all sorts of mixed race folks from Saint-Domingue to go and fight the battles of Savannah, which they then do. And those mixed race folks then come back to Saint-Domingue with all sorts of ideas in their head about rights and liberty and liberation and so forth that then kind of manifest themselves in some pretty interesting ways in the 1790s. It's also the case that the forms of the American Revolution are really important for the Haitian revolutionaries. So January 1st, 1804, the Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who's sort of Toussaint Louverture's successor, Louverture has died in prison in France, issues a declaration of Haitian independence that's modeled in many respects after the American Declaration of Independence, in that it's speaking both to people in Haiti, so the former slaves themselves, and to the international community about placing Haiti now in a kind of republic or league of nations. So I think there's lots of different ways, sort of from the kind of lowfalutin, if that's a word, sort of social level, that the American Revolution is important, and on the kind of level of international diplomacy. I think it's really crucial.
Yeah, I think the Declaration of Independence is what I would point to in terms of, in your founding document, you have these high-flying ideals of liberty and equality, which were, strictly speaking, unnecessary. Most of the document is this declaration of grievances against George III, and that's all you strictly really needed to do. But they add these high-flying ideas that have these ongoing impact and allow you to cite them as part of the overall zeitgeist of revolution in this era. But beyond Haiti, there's also work by historian David Armitage has really shown that not just in Haiti, but any other colony that's going to declare its independence, that's what you do, right? That's how you gain your sovereignty if you have been part of someone else's empire, is you declare your independence, you declare why you're gaining your sovereignty, you declare your list of grievances and reasons, and this spreads to Latin America, to other parts of the world in the 20th century. So the Declaration of Independence, both in terms of sovereignty and this rights talk, ends up being important. Maybe not as important as Americans want to think it is, but still important. And that probably leads to what Karen would like to say.
Well, I mean, the French had been coming up with lists of grievances since the Middle Ages, so I think we have to say maybe that might be a universal human thing. But the question that I was thinking of while these guys were talking is, I think, and Chris, maybe you can answer this. I don't think the Haitian Revolution would have happened without the French Revolution. Yes.
Correct.
Right. So would the French Revolution have happened without the American Revolution? I think it would have. So there may have been some incidental contacts, and again, Matt might have something else to say about that, but the French Revolution was taking an old political system and an economic system as well that was no longer working and trying to create something new. And in the process, they end up implementing a lot of the ideas of the Enlightenment. But I don't know how many of the revolutionaries were specifically trying to recreate anything that happened in the Americas because it was just so different. Does that mean they weren't reading some of the things that had been written by some of these American revolutionaries? No, I think they probably were. But they saw themselves as completely different from what was happening in the Americas. Yes.
All right, please join me in thanking our presenters for a really interesting hour.